In the year 1842, something strange began happening on a cotton plantation deep in Mississippi. At first, people believed it was just sickness. An overseer collapsed after supper. 2 days later, the plantation owner himself became violently ill. By the end of that month, 5 powerful men who ruled that land were dead. Doctors blamed fever. Neighbors blamed spoiled food. But among the enslaved workers, a different rumor began to spread quietly through the cabins at night. Someone on that plantation was killing the masters, slowly, carefully. And whoever was doing it had access to their food every single day, because the deaths always began after supper. Welcome to ASHEN Truths, where we uncover the darkest forgotten stories in history. Tonight's story is about a quiet cook on a Mississippi plantation and the deadly secret hidden inside his kitchen. Harper's Ridge Plantation. In the early 1840s, along the banks of a slow, muddy stream known as Red Willow Creek, stood a plantation called Harper's Ridge. The land stretched for miles. Cotton fields covered most of the property, white fibers glowing under the Mississippi sun like patches of snow. At the center of the plantation stood a large wooden house with tall columns and wide windows. It belonged to Jonathan Harper. Harper had inherited the plantation from his father many years earlier, and under his control the land had grown profitable. But the success of Harper's Ridge came at a terrible cost. Jonathan Harper ruled the plantation with fear. He believed cruelty kept workers obedient. Punishments were frequent. Whippings were public. And the enslaved men and women who worked those fields lived with the constant knowledge that their lives meant nothing to the man who owned them. Each morning before sunrise, a bell rang across the plantation. The sound echoed through the slave cabins like a warning. Workers lined up before the overseers and were sent to the cotton fields. Under the hot sun, they worked hour after hour, picking, carrying, moving and through the endless rows of plants. But while most slaves worked in the fields, there was another part of the plantation where the work looked very different: the kitchen. Behind the main house stood a separate brick building where meals were prepared for the Harper family and their guests. Inside that kitchen worked a small group of enslaved servants, and among them was a man named Isaiah. Isaiah had been on the plantation longer than most people could remember. Some believed he had arrived there as a teenager. Now his hair carried streaks of gray, and his back bent slightly when he walked. But Isaiah possessed a skill that made him extremely valuable to Jonathan Harper. He could cook, and not just ordinary meals. Isaiah could prepare food that impressed even wealthy plantation owners visiting from nearby counties. Roasted meats seasoned perfectly, fresh bread baked until golden brown, thick stews flavored with herbs gathered from the nearby woods. Visitors often complimented Harper on his cook. Some even joked that Isaiah was worth more than several field workers combined. Because of this, Isaiah spent most of his time in the kitchen rather than the cotton fields. But working so close to the main house meant Isaiah saw things others did not. He heard the masters speaking during supper. He listened to their plans, their complaints, their arguments. And over the years, Isaiah witnessed cruelty that most people could hardly imagine. He saw men whipped until their backs tore open. He saw children taken away from their mothers and sold to traders. He saw punishment carried out simply because a man looked too tired to continue working. Isaiah never spoke about these things, not openly. On the outside, he appeared obedient, quiet, a cook who followed orders and kept his head down. But inside his mind, something had been slowly building for years. Anger. A deep, silent anger that grew each time he watched another act of cruelty unfold. And sometime during the summer of 1842, Something happened that finally pushed Isaiah beyond silence. Something that would change the fate of Harper's Ridge forever. Because not long after that summer began, the masters of the plantation would start dying, one by one. And no one suspected the quiet cook standing beside the kitchen fire. The incident that changed everything. For many years, Isaiah had survived Harper's Ridge the same way most enslaved people survived plantations. By staying quiet, by keeping his head down, by pretending not to notice the cruelty happening around him. The kitchen allowed him a small distance from the worst punishments of the fields. While the field workers suffered beneath the sun, Isaiah spent most of his days beside iron pots and open flames, preparing meals for the Harper family. But working in the kitchen did not mean he was free from the horrors of the plantation. In fact, the kitchen often brought him closer to them. Every evening, Isaiah carried trays of food into the main house, and during those meals he saw the masters laugh, drink, and talk casually about punishments that had been carried out earlier in the day. Sometimes they spoke about it the way hunters speak about animals. One night during supper, Jonathan Harper's younger brother, William Harper, had been visiting the plantation. William was known to be even more reckless than Jonathan. He drank heavily and enjoyed humiliating the slaves whenever he had the chance. That night, as Isaiah placed dishes on the long wooden dining table, William pointed his fork toward the window. "See that man out there?" he said, laughing. Through the window, Isaiah could see a worker standing in the yard with his hands tied behind his back. The man's name was Samuel. Samuel had been caught earlier that day trying to visit his wife on a neighboring plantation without permission. Jonathan Harper leaned back in his chair. "Thinks he can leave my property whenever he wants," Harper said coldly. William chuckled. "What are you going to do with him?" Harper took a slow sip of his drink. "Teach him a lesson." Isaiah stood quietly near the wall as the conversation continued. He had learned long ago that speaking during these moments could bring trouble, so he simply listened and watched. After supper ended, the Harper brothers walked outside. Several overseers followed them. Isaiah stood at the kitchen doorway as the punishment began. Samuel was tied to a wooden post in the yard. The thought lingered in his mind. Isaiah did not act that night or the next, but the idea had already taken root, and once it did, it would not leave him. Within weeks, the first death would occur at Harper's Ridge, and no one would suspect the quiet cook working beside the kitchener. The first death. For several weeks after Samuel's punishment, life at Harper's Ridge returned to its usual routine. The bell rang before sunrise. Workers filled the cotton fields. Overseers patrolled the rows on horseback. And inside the kitchen, Isaiah prepared meals just as he had for many years. To anyone watching, nothing about him had changed. He spoke little. He followed orders. And every evening he carried supper from the kitchen into the main house. But inside his mind, Isaiah had begun paying closer attention to something he had never studied so carefully before. The plants growing beyond the plantation. The woods around Red Willow Creek were filled with herbs, roots, and berries that most. Plants that could harm. People ignored. But Isaiah had learned about many of them long ago, before he was brought to Harper's Ridge. As a young boy, he had lived with an older woman who understood the healing power of plants. She taught him which leaves eased fever, which roots helped wounds heal faster, and which berries should never be eaten. Some plants could stop pain, others could stop a heart. Isaiah remembered those lessons clearly. And in the weeks following Samuel's beating, he began quietly gathering certain plants when no one was watching. Small amounts at first, a few leaves, a few crushed seeds, Nothing that would draw attention. He dried them carefully and hid them among the ordinary cooking herbs inside the kitchen. Then Isaiah waited. Because poisoning someone required patience. Too much at once would cause immediate suspicion. But a small amount, spread across several meals, could slowly weaken a man without anyone understanding why. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. One evening near the end of August, Jonathan Harper invited several men from neighboring plantations for dinner. Visitors were common at Harper's Ridge. Plantation owners often met to discuss crops, prices, and business. That night, the kitchen prepared a large meal. Roasted pork, cornbread, sweet potatoes, thick stew seasoned with herbs. Isaiah worked carefully beside the stove while the other kitchen workers prepared the side dishes. At one point, he stood alone over the large pot of stew simmering above the fire. The rich smell filled the room. Isaiah glanced toward the open kitchen door. No one was watching. From his pocket, he removed a small cloth bundle. Inside were crushed seeds from a plant known for causing violent sickness when eaten. He had tested the plant in very small amounts before, just enough to understand its strength. Isaiah carefully dropped a pinch of the powder into the pot. Then he stirred the stew slowly until it disappeared. The rest of the meal continued normally. The food was carried into the main house. Guests laughed loudly around the dining table. Wine was poured, stories were shared. Isaiah stood quietly near the wall, just as he always did during supper. Jonathan Harper and his guests ate heavily. They praised the food, especially the stew. One man even joked that Harper's cook could make a meal taste better than anything in town. Isaiah lowered his eyes politely. He said nothing. The dinner ended late that night. The visitors returned to their horses. The house grew quiet again. For a moment, Isaiah wondered if the poison had been too small to matter. Then the first scream came. It came from the main house shortly after midnight. A loud crash echoed through the hallway, then shouting. Kitchen workers rushed outside to see what was happening. Inside the house, one of the overseers had collapsed. He lay on the floor beside a chair, clutching his stomach. His breathing came in sharp, painful bursts. Sweat covered his face. Jonathan Harper stood over him, confused and angry. "What's wrong with him?" Harper demanded. The overseer could barely speak. "Stomach burning." Within minutes, the man began vomiting violently. A doctor from a nearby town was called before sunrise. By the time the doctor arrived, the overseer was dead. The doctor examined the body carefully. But medicine during the 1840s could explain very little about sudden sickness. After some time, the doctor gave his conclusion. "Most likely, spoiled food," he said. Harper cursed loudly when he heard that. He stormed into the kitchen later that morning. "Which one of you cooked last night's meal?" he demanded. All eyes turned toward Isaiah. Isaiah stepped forward slowly. "I did, sir." Harper stared at him for several long seconds. But Isaiah had cooked meals for the plantation for many years without trouble. The master finally waved his hand dismissively. "Be more careful next time," Harper snapped. Then he walked away. The plantation returned to work as usual. But something had changed. That night, as Isaiah stood alone in the kitchen again, he understood something important. The death had raised no real suspicion. The doctor blamed spoiled food. The master blamed bad luck. No one imagined that the quiet cook might have caused it deliberately. And that realization made Isaiah understand something even more dangerous. If he was careful, he could do it again, when fear began to spread. At first, the death of the overseer was treated as an unfortunate accident. Plantation life continued the same way it always had. The fields remained full of workers. The bell still rang before sunrise, and Jonathan Harper returned to his usual routine as if nothing had happened. But something small had changed. For the first time in many years, the masters of Harper's Ridge had been reminded that their control was not absolute. Death had entered their world unexpectedly, and they did not understand why. Inside the kitchen, Isaiah continued his work quietly. He prepared breakfast each morning, lunch for the field supervisors, and supper for the Harper family and their guests. No one watched him any more closely than before. The death had not created suspicion, only irritation. Jonathan Harper had simply blamed poor ingredients and demanded that the meals be prepared more carefully. To him, the matter was finished. But Isaiah knew something the master did not. The first death had not been an accident, and it would not be the last. For several days after the overseer died, Isaiah added nothing unusual to the meals. He allowed time to pass. Poison, he understood, worked best when no one could trace a clear pattern. Too many deaths too quickly would raise questions. Patience was the safest path. Meanwhile, Samuel slowly recovered from the whipping he had suffered weeks earlier. He moved carefully while working in the fields, his back still healing. Isaiah saw him only from a distance now and then. They rarely spoke. Plantation life made it dangerous for enslaved families to show their connections openly. But each time Isaiah saw his son struggling in the fields, the anger inside him hardened. And eventually, the moment came again. About 2 weeks after the overseer's death, Jonathan Harper hosted another dinner in the main house. This time the guest was Harper's brother, William Harper, who had returned to the plantation for several days. William was known throughout the region as a reckless man. He drank heavily. He enjoyed humiliating the slaves, and his temper could turn violent without warning. The moment he arrived at Harper's Ridge, trouble followed. On the second evening of his visit, William wandered into the kitchen while Isaiah prepared supper. The smell of roasting meat filled the room. William leaned against the doorway, holding a bottle in his hand. "So this is the man everyone praises," he said lazily. Isaiah continued stirring the pot without looking up. "Yes, sir." William stepped closer. "I heard you poison one of my brother's overseers." Isaiah finally looked at him. His face remained calm. "That was spoiled meat, sir. The doctor said so." William laughed loudly. "Of course he did." He took a long drink from the bottle. Then he grabbed a piece of bread from the table and bit into it. "You know," William continued, "I never trust cooks." Isaiah said nothing. William watched him carefully for a moment. Then he smiled in a cruel way. "But I trust hunger even less." He tossed the empty bottle onto the table and walked out of the kitchen. Isaiah listened to his footsteps disappear toward the house. For a moment he stood perfectly still. Then he returned his attention to the pot of stew simmering over the fire. The opportunity was there again. William Harper would be eating supper that night, just like the overseer had 2 weeks earlier. And just like before, no one would question the cook. Isaiah reached into his pocket slowly. Inside was another small cloth bundle. He carefully crushed the dried plant inside his fingers. This time the powder looked slightly darker, stronger. Isaiah added only a small amount to the stew. Then he stirred it slowly until it vanished. Later that evening, the meal was served. Jonathan Harper sat at the head of the table. William sat beside him. They laughed loudly and drank heavily as they ate. William especially seemed to enjoy the stew. "This cook of yours is worth keeping," he told his brother between bites. Jonathan Harper nodded proudly. "I told you." Isaiah stood silently against the wall, watching. Because accidents might happen once, but twice. Something felt wrong, and the quiet cook who prepared every meal stood silently inside the kitchen as the plantation began to whisper about death. Suspicion in the main house. The death of William Harper changed the atmosphere of the plantation almost immediately. When the first overseer died, Jonathan Harper had treated it as bad luck. But the death of his own brother was different. William had been strong and healthy only hours before the sickness struck. Now he was gone, and the doctor could offer no clear explanation. By midday the next day, a small group of men had gathered in the main house to discuss what had happened. Jonathan Harper sat at the head of the table, his face tight with anger. Across from him sat the plantation doctor and two neighboring landowners who had arrived after hearing the news. The doctor spoke carefully. "I have seen sickness like this before," he said, "but it is difficult to explain. It may be something he ate." Harper slammed his fist onto the table. "You said the same thing when my overseer died." The doctor hesitated. "Yes, but illness sometimes spreads through food supplies." One of the visiting plantation owners leaned forward. "You mean spoiled meat?" "Possibly," the doctor said. But even as he spoke, the explanation sounded weak, because the strange illness had affected only two men, both powerful, both sitting at the same table, and both dying suddenly after supper. Jonathan Harper stared down at the table for several moments. Then he said something that made the room grow quiet. "Maybe someone is poisoning us." The other men exchanged uneasy looks. Poisoning was not something plantation owners liked to consider, but the idea was not impossible. Plantations were full of people who had reason to hate their masters. One of the visiting landowners spoke carefully. If that were true, the poison would have to come through the kitchen. Harper's jaw tightened. The kitchen. That meant Isaiah. For many years, Harper had trusted the cook completely. Isaiah had prepared meals for the plantation longer than some overseers had even worked there. But now doubt began creeping into Harper's mind. "Bring the cook here," he ordered. A servant hurried to the kitchen. Isaiah was quietly cutting vegetables when the message arrived. "Master Harper wants to see you," the servant said nervously. Isaiah wiped his hands slowly and walked toward the main house. Inside the dining room, several men watched him closely as he entered. Jonathan Harper leaned forward. "Isaiah," he said, his voice calm but cold. "Yes, sir?" "You prepared the meals on the nights those men died?" Isaiah nodded. "Yes, sir." Harper studied his face carefully. "Did you put anything unusual in the food?" Isaiah shook his head. "No, sir." One of the visitors stood up and walked closer to Isaiah. "Do you understand what we're asking?" the man said. "Yes, sir." "Two men have died after eating meals you prepared." Isaiah remained silent for a moment, then he answered carefully. "Many people ate those meals, sir." The men glanced at one another. It was true. On both nights, several people had eaten the same food, yet only one person had become sick each time. That detail made the idea of poisoning harder to explain. Jonathan Harper leaned back slowly in his chair. "Leave us," he said finally. Isaiah nodded and walked calmly out of the room. But as he stepped outside the house, he knew something had changed. The masters were no longer ignoring the deaths. They were beginning to question them, and that meant the danger had grown much greater. Inside the kitchen that evening, Isaiah worked in silence. The other kitchen servants whispered nervously about the recent deaths. Rumors had already begun spreading across the plantation. Some slaves believed the deaths were punishment from God. Others believed the plantation had become cursed. But Isaiah knew the truth. And he also understood something important. Two deaths had already created suspicion. If another man died too soon, the masters might begin watching the kitchen more closely. Isaiah would need to be careful. But he also knew something else. Jonathan Harper was still alive, the man responsible for Samuel's suffering. the man who had ruled the plantation with cruelty for years. Isaiah had not forgotten him, and if he was going to finish what he had started, he would have to be patient. Because eventually, Jonathan Harper would sit down at the dinner table again. And when that happened, the most powerful man on Harper's Ridge might become the next to fall, the third death. After the questioning in the main house, the atmosphere at Harper's Ridge changed in ways that everyone could feel. Jonathan Harper became more cautious. For several days, he refused to eat anything prepared in the kitchen until someone else had tasted it first. One of the house servants was ordered to sample every dish before it reached the dining table. The overseers watched the slaves more closely in the fields, and the doctor remained on the plantation longer than usual, trying to understand the strange sickness that had already claimed 2 lives. But even with these precautions, something else was happening quietly beneath the surface. Fear, not just among the enslaved workers, but among the masters themselves. 2 men had died suddenly after eating supper, and no one could explain why. Isaiah noticed the change immediately. He moved carefully in the kitchen now, saying even less than usual. Every ingredient was watched. Every plate was examined. The servants who carried food into the main house had become nervous. Some even whispered that the plantation had been cursed. Isaiah listened to the rumors without speaking, because he understood something the others did not. Fear made people careless. When people were frightened, they often stopped thinking clearly. And slowly, as the days passed without another death, the masters began relaxing their precautions. The servant who tasted the food before supper stopped doing so every night. The doctor returned to town, and Jonathan Harper slowly returned to his normal habits. But Isaiah did not rush. He waited nearly 3 weeks before acting again. During that time, Samuel's condition in the fields worsened. The beating he had received earlier that summer had left scars that healed slowly. Some mornings he struggled to lift the heavy cotton sacks assigned to him. One afternoon, Isaiah saw him stumble in the field from exhaustion. An overseer struck him across the shoulders with a stick and forced him back to work. Isaiah watched the moment from the distance near the kitchen garden. His face remained calm. But inside him, the anger returned stronger than before. And that night, he made his decision. The opportunity came during another supper gathering in the main house. This time, Jonathan Harper had invited 2 plantation managers from nearby farms to discuss cotton prices and land agreements. The men sat together in the dining room, drinking whiskey while Isaiah prepared the evening meal. The kitchen was busy. Several servants moved in and out carrying dishes. Isaiah prepared roasted chicken and a thick vegetable stew that simmered slowly over the fire. But this time, he did not place the poison in the stew. The stew would be shared by too many people. Instead, he prepared something different. A small sauce served only with the roasted chicken placed before the head of the table. Jonathan Harper's plate. Isaiah worked slowly while the other kitchen servants focused on the larger dishes. From his pocket, he removed another cloth bundle. This powder was made from crushed seeds of a plant that caused severe illness when consumed, even in small amounts. He carefully mixed the powder into the sauce. Then he stirred until it disappeared completely. The plate was carried into the dining room minutes later. Jonathan Harper ate the meal while discussing business with his guests. He appeared perfectly healthy. The dinner ended normally. The visitors left the plantation shortly after sunset, and for a moment Isaiah wondered if the poison had once again gone unnoticed. But just before midnight, the plantation erupted in panic. "Master Harper is sick." Isaiah walked toward the house with the others. Inside the bedroom, Jonathan Harper sat on the edge of his bed, struggling to breathe. His face had turned pale. Sweat soaked his shirt. He clutched his stomach in agony. The doctor was called again immediately, but the sickness moved quickly, much faster than before. Within a few hours, Jonathan Harper's condition became critical. The doctor examined him carefully, but seemed deeply confused. "This is not fever," he finally said. The room fell silent. "If it is not fever," one of the overseers asked, "then what is it?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "It may be poison." The word spread through the house like fire. Poison. Suddenly every suspicious thought the masters had whispered about before returned with force. 2 men had already died. Now the plantation owner himself was dying. One of the house servants ran toward the kitchen, shouting. By sunrise, Jonathan Harper stopped breathing. The most powerful man on Harper's Ridge was dead. And for the first time since the strange deaths began, the masters knew with certainty that something was terribly wrong, because 3 powerful men had now died, and the doctor had finally spoken the word everyone feared: poison. The investigation. By the morning Jonathan Harper died, Harper's Ridge Plantation had fallen into complete confusion. The most powerful man on the land was gone. His brother had already died weeks earlier. An overseer had died before that. 3 deaths, all following the same terrifying pattern, all beginning after supper. And now the plantation doctor had spoken the word no one wanted to hear: poison. The moment that word spread, the atmosphere across Harper's Ridge changed overnight. Fear turned into suspicion, and suspicion quickly turned into anger, because if poison had been used, then someone on the plantation had done it. The overseers began questioning the house servants first. Every person who worked inside the main house was brought into the dining room and questioned one by one. The servants who carried the plates, the maid who cleaned the dining room, the men who delivered supplies from town. Each person was asked the same questions again and again. Did you see anyone near the food? Did anyone touch the master's plate? Did anyone act strangely in the kitchen? But the answers were always the same. No, no, and no. Because the truth was simple. The only person who had complete control over the food before it reached the table was the cook. And eventually the overseers turned their attention to Isaiah. 2 men entered the kitchen late that afternoon. Isaiah was standing beside the fire, stirring a pot of soup. Isaiah," one of the overseers said. "Yes, sir. You need to come with us." Isaiah placed the spoon down slowly and followed them toward the main house. Inside the dining room, several men were waiting. Among them was a lawyer from the nearby town who had come to settle the Harper estate after the master's sudden death. The lawyer studied Isaiah carefully as he entered the room. "So you're the cook," the man said. "Yes, sir." "You prepared the meals on the nights those men died?" Isaiah nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." The lawyer walked slowly around the table. 3 men have died after eating food you prepared." Isaiah remained silent. "Can you explain that?" Isaiah looked down at the floor briefly before answering. "No, sir." One of the overseers stepped forward angrily. "You expect us to believe that?" he snapped. Isaiah said nothing. The lawyer raised his hand slightly, stopping the overseer. "Let him answer," he said calmly. Then he turned back to Isaiah. "Did you put anything unusual in the food?" "No, sir." The room grew quiet, because once again the same problem remained. Many people had eaten the same meals, yet only 1 man had fallen sick each time. That detail made it difficult to prove anything. If the cook had poisoned the food, why had only 1 person died? The lawyer finally sighed. "Unless we find evidence," he said slowly, We cannot accuse a man based only on suspicion. The overseers looked frustrated, but the lawyer was correct. There was no proof, and accusing a cook without proof could cause panic among the other plantation workers. Isaiah was dismissed and allowed to return to the kitchen. But from that moment forward, the plantation was no longer the same. The kitchen was watched more closely. Overseers entered without warning. Ingredients were inspected, and meals were tasted before they reached the table again. The investigation continued for days, then weeks, but the truth remained hidden. Because Isaiah had already stopped, Jonathan Harper had been his final target. The man responsible for Samuel's suffering. The man who ruled Harper's Ridge with cruelty. And now he was gone. Without Jonathan Harper, the plantation quickly began falling apart. His heirs did not want to manage the land. The lawyer arranged for the property to be sold. Workers were transferred to other plantations. Overseers left to find new employment. Within months, Harper's Ridge was no longer the powerful plantation it had once been, and the mysterious deaths were never officially solved. No one was ever charged. No one was ever proven guilty. But among the enslaved workers who once lived there, a quiet story continued to circulate for many years. They believed the masters had finally been punished, and that punishment had come from the last person anyone expected. The quiet cook who prepared their meals. The disappearance of Isaiah. After the death of Jonathan Harper, Harper's Ridge plantation began to unravel faster than anyone expected. Without its owner, the land had no clear direction. The lawyer sent from town worked quickly to organize Harper's estate. Accounts were examined. Debts were reviewed. And within a short time, it became clear that no one in the Harper family wanted the responsibility of running the plantation. The land would be sold. Until that happened, the plantation operated in a strange and uneasy silence. The overseers still supervised the fields, but their authority felt weaker. The workers noticed it. Even the house servants could feel that something had changed. The man who once ruled the land through fear was gone, and with him, the power that had kept Harper's Ridge tightly controlled had begun to disappear. But the mystery of the deaths still lingered. The lawyer continued asking questions whenever he visited. The doctor reviewed his notes again and again. The overseers whispered among themselves about the poison that must have been used, but no one could prove who had done it. And as the weeks passed, the investigation slowly faded away. The plantation had bigger problems now: land sales, financial debts, and the relocation of dozens of enslaved workers. During those weeks, Isaiah continued working in the kitchen, just as he always had. Meals were prepared, bread was baked, stew simmered over the fire. To anyone watching him, he appeared unchanged. Quiet, patient, invisible. But something about Isaiah had shifted as well. The anger that had lived inside him for so long had finally burned itself out. Jonathan Harper was gone. The man who had ordered Samuel's beating. The man responsible for years of cruelty across the plantation. Isaiah had waited many years for that moment, and now it had come. One evening, near the end of autumn in 1842, Isaiah stood outside the kitchen watching the sun disappear behind the cotton fields. The harvest season was ending. Cold winds had begun moving across the land, and many of the workers would soon be sent to different plantations once Harper's Ridge was sold. Samuel approached slowly from the direction of the cabins. His back had healed enough for him to work again, though the scars remained. For a long moment, father and son stood beside each other in silence. Neither spoke at first. Then Samuel finally asked a quiet question. "Do you think things will change now?" Isaiah looked across the darkening fields. "I don't know," he answered. Samuel studied his father's face carefully. "There are many rumors," he said. Isaiah said nothing. Samuel lowered his voice. "They say someone poisoned the masters." Still, Isaiah did not respond. The two stood there quietly for several seconds before Samuel nodded slightly. "I hope whoever did it escaped," he said softly. Isaiah placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the truth is safer when no one speaks it." That night, Isaiah prepared one final meal in the kitchen at Harper's Ridge. The fire burned low, the pots were cleaned, and the kitchen slowly grew quiet. Early the next morning, one of the servants entered the kitchen to begin breakfast preparations. But Isaiah was gone. His sleeping place behind the kitchen building was empty. His few belongings had disappeared, and no one on the plantation had seen him leave. The overseers searched the nearby woods. They questioned the workers. But Isaiah was never found. Some believed he had escaped during the night. Others believed someone helped him leave before the plantation changed ownership. But among the enslaved workers who had lived on Harper's Ridge, another belief quietly spread. They believed Isaiah had simply disappeared into the world beyond the plantation, carrying his secret with him, and the strange deaths that destroyed Harper's Ridge slowly faded into history. Unsolved, unproven, but never forgotten. Stories like this remind us that history is not only written by powerful men. Sometimes it is shaped quietly by people the world barely noticed. People who endured suffering for years, and who, when pushed too far, found their own way to fight back. Here on Ashen Truths, we uncover the dark and forgotten stories hidden deep within history. Stories of survival, stories of resistance, and stories that remind us how complicated the past can be. If you enjoy uncovering these forgotten truths, make sure to subscribe to ASHEN Truths, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Isaiah truly poisoned the plantation masters? Or do you believe the deaths were something else entirely? Let me know what you think. And if you enjoy stories like this, there are many more waiting to be uncovered here on Ashen Truths. Until the next story, thank you for watching.